Talk to youth workers, I will frequently, pull out my cell phone and say, a lot of us relate to our smartphones as if our lives depended on them. Maybe we could take a small step into Sabbath practice by powering down the phone as a way of concretely saying, my life doesn't ultimately depend on this phone or what it represents or the tasks I can accomplish by way of this phone. My life ultimately depends on God's grace and provision. And then, of course, people want to know, well, what might that concretely look like? And one of my favorite stories about Sabbath practice comes from a seminary student who showed up at a seminary, and her first semester was overwhelmed with not so much the explicit expectations that were put on her, but by the expectations that she put on herself, and just a feeling that she could never be enough, she could never do enough, she could never be smart enough, she could never read enough to fit in and to belong at her school. And when she heard about Sabbath and this idea of putting down something that it appears your life depends on, she thought about these expectations, and she thought, maybe my way of practicing Sabbath is to put aside those expectations for a day. And so she started doing this. And it was very difficult for her, and yet she persevered. And in the end, I had a conversation with her, and I said, how's it been going with this Sabbath practice, and what's God been doing in the midst of this Sabbath practice? And she was silent for a while, and she thought about it, and she said, I think that in the midst of this Sabbath practice, I have heard God say to me, you are my beloved child. For me, then, that brings it full circle back to the busyness question. If our young people are saying, I'm busy, I would rather they say, I'm a child of God. But the only way to get there is to allow that sort of misplaced identity of who am I, I'm busy. That identity has to die. And that is extremely difficult. And I think we can see that in the Israelites in the wilderness. We can see it in the seminary student's life who had to let go of those expectations. Those expectations had to die. The old identity for the Israelites about being producers and brick makers, that had to die in order that a new life could emerge. And so my hope for busy young people is that they could die to the identity of merely being a busy person, to embrace themselves as God sees them, and that is as God's beloved children.